Stunning new developments in the case of 3 Michigan children abandoned by their mother, police say, and left to fend for themselves for years. Officers found the children, siblings ages 15, 13, and 12, an older boy and 2 younger girls, when the landlord asked for a welfare check.
The call that started it all wasn't anything out of the ordinary. A landlord, growing increasingly concerned about not hearing from his tenant, decided to call 911. It was a routine welfare check, one that should have been no different than any other. But what the officers would find that day in Pontiac, Michigan, was beyond anyone's imagination, a nightmare that felt too surreal to be real. It was Valentine's Day, a day meant for love and connection, but instead, it would be forever tied to a horrifying discovery. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the empty streets, a 911 operator picked up the call, completely unaware of the chaos that would soon unfold. A man was on the other end, his voice trembling with confusion and worry. His tenant had stopped paying rent, stopped communicating, and the silence was deafening. All he knew was that something wasn't right, and he needed help. Little did anyone know, behind the walls of that house lived 3 children. Children who had not seen the light of day in years. Their names? A 15-year-old boy, a 13-year-old girl, and a 12-year-old girl. The last time they had lived a normal life? No one could say. All the world knew was that these children had been abandoned in the most unimaginable way. Abandoned by the one person who should have loved and protected them, their own mother. It wasn't just a day or 2, not even a week. No, this had been going on since at least 2021. The years stretched on, unnoticed, as these children were left in a state of complete isolation. When the police arrived, they were faced with a scene unlike any they'd ever encountered. The house, once a home, had become a prison. A prison with walls covered in filth, piles of trash and mold in every corner. Feces everywhere. The children's living conditions were so horrific that it felt like something straight out of a horror movie. But it was real. It was happening right then and there. The walls told the story of the despair, of the neglect that had festered for so long. The officers who stepped in, their faces grim, knew this would haunt them for the rest of their careers. The children, once full of life, were now little more than shadows of themselves. Their hair matted and tangled, their clothes soiled beyond recognition, and their toenails? So long they could barely walk. It was clear that they hadn't had any grooming, hadn't had basic hygiene products for years. They didn't even know what it meant to brush their teeth. How could they? They had been trapped in that house for so long, forced to live in their own filth. Their mother? She was nowhere to be found. She had vanished, leaving them behind with no explanation, no excuse. The kids had not attended school in years. Not a single teacher, not a single neighbor, not even their own extended family knew they were out of sight, living this nightmare. The 15-year-old boy, barely able to speak coherently, managed to whisper one chilling detail. Their mother would visit once a week, but only to drop off pre-prepared food at the porch. It wasn't love. It wasn't care. It was a cold, distant act of neglect, leaving them to fend for themselves. The police, realizing the grave danger the children were in, moved quickly. But as they approached the house, something wasn't right. The children had been hiding. The house, locked and barricaded, seemed to keep its secrets hidden deep inside. It was like the house itself had become a barrier, refusing to let anyone see the horror behind its doors. And then, when the officers forced the door open, they were met with an overwhelming stench, a mixture of decay and rot. But it wasn't just the smell that shocked them. It was the sight of it all. The house was unlivable, the toilet and bathtub unusable due to the overwhelming filth. The officers knew they had to act fast. The conditions were so bad that investigators had to wear hazmat suits just to process the scene. It was a chilling realization that the children's suffering was far worse than anyone could have imagined. They had been living like this for so long, isolated from the world, hidden in plain sight. As the investigation unfolded, one question lingered in the air. How had no one known? How had no one seen the signs? The neighbors, the school, their family. How had they all missed this? The answers seemed almost impossible to fathom. But the truth was there, in front of them, plain as day. A tragedy of unimaginable proportions had been unfolding in a house that was supposed to be a safe haven. Things take an even darker turn as investigators uncover shocking details that will leave you speechless. Stay tuned. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Imagine a community, a neighborhood filled with familiar faces. People see each other every day, wave as they walk past, share a moment of small talk at the local grocery store. But what if, right in the midst of this, something unimaginable is happening? What if, behind closed doors, children are being neglected, trapped in a life of filth, isolation, and fear? And what if no one notices? In Pontiac, Michigan, this was the heartbreaking reality. For years, 3 children lived in a house where the walls should have been filled with laughter, love, and safety. Instead, they were suffocated by silence and neglect. They were left alone, abandoned by the one person who should have been their protector, their own mother. What is even more shocking is that, despite the horrifying conditions, the neighbors, the school district, and the children's extended family all seemed blind to what was happening right in front of them. How could this be? How could the children go unnoticed, unhelped, for so long? This question is one that left the community reeling when the truth finally came to light. The children had not attended school for years. In a neighborhood that seemed to be full of eyes watching, no one seemed to notice their absence. The Pontiac School District confirmed that the children were not enrolled, yet no one raised the alarm. Was there no one looking out for them? Was there no teacher, no counselor who would have noticed the silence, the empty desks, the absence of these kids year after year? It's a question that stings because it's so easy to see the signs when we look back at it, but no one did. No one cared enough to act. And what about the neighbors? The ones who lived closest to the house? How did they miss the constant sound of loneliness that echoed from behind that door? Did they not hear the strange, unsettling quiet? Were they so caught up in their own lives that they couldn't see what was happening right next door? Some of the neighbors even admitted that they had seen the mother coming and going. She would leave, carrying bags, never once seen with her children. Yet, not a single person thought to ask, where are the kids? Then, there was the chilling revelation that the mother, the very person who had abandoned her children, was still active on social media, just days before her arrest. While her children were locked away in squalor, neglected, and suffering, she was posting on Facebook. She wasn't asking for help. No, she was advertising a food giveaway. The contrast between her online persona and the reality of her children's situation was eerie. How could she pretend that everything was fine? How could she go on with life as if nothing was wrong, when behind closed doors, her children were living in unimaginable conditions? It's almost like a twisted game of deception. On one hand, she painted a picture of a woman giving back to the community. On the other hand, she had her children hidden away, unseen by the world. How could anyone do this? How could anyone live a double life like this? The mind struggles to comprehend it. When the community found out, they were devastated. There was disbelief at first, a sense of shock. How could this happen right here, in our own backyard? It wasn't just a case of neglect. It was years of suffering, hidden in plain sight. The neighbors, now faced with the truth, were filled with anger, frustration, and confusion. They couldn't understand how they had missed it. They felt guilty. They felt responsible. The sense of powerlessness was overwhelming. The question echoed in every corner of the neighborhood. How could we have let this happen? The emotional toll on the community was deep. How could they have turned a blind eye? Could they have done more? Were they too busy with their own lives, caught in their own world, to notice the quiet screams of a family in crisis? It was a bitter pill to swallow, one that would haunt them for years to come. This story isn't just about the children and their suffering. It's also about the larger issue of social responsibility. It's about how communities need to look out for each other, how every neighbor has a role to play in preventing something like this from happening. It's a reminder that silence can be deadly, and that sometimes doing nothing is just as harmful as doing the wrong thing. As we look at the faces of those children, we are left with the reality that, in some cases, the people closest to us are the ones who can hurt us the most. And yet, the community now has a chance to come together to make sure this kind of neglect never happens again, to learn from the past and move forward, stronger, united. But what happens next? What happens when the mother is arrested? What happens to the children who have suffered for so long? And what can the community do now to make it right? If you've been shocked by this story, if you've been heartbroken by what these children have endured, I urge you to share this video. Share it with everyone you know. Let the world see what happens when we ignore our responsibility to protect those who need us the most. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates. Let's stand together, raise our voices, and make sure this story is heard. Let's make sure it never happens again. The quiet hum of daily life can sometimes mask the loudest screams. In a community where everyone thought they knew what was going on behind closed doors, one family's secret had gone unnoticed for years. The three children, ages 15, 13, and 12, lived a life so isolated, so tragic, that it was beyond the scope of what most people could even imagine. But when the day finally came, when the authorities broke through that door, the truth could no longer stay hidden. The mother, the woman who should have been their protector, had abandoned them, and her arrest was inevitable. When the police arrived at her location to arrest her, it happened quickly. She was taken without incident, as though she was finally caught in a web of her own making. There was no dramatic standoff, no fiery confrontation. It was quiet. It was swift. Yet the horror of the situation lingered, heavy in the air. Her name? It wasn't revealed, not because of any leniency, but to protect the children's privacy, to shield them from further trauma. They had already suffered too much, and the world did not need to know their mother's identity. The truth, while painful, was already out there. She had left her children to fend for themselves in a house covered in filth, in the darkest corners of neglect. As the mother faced the legal system, one thing was clear: her actions were unforgivable. The charges? They would come soon. And as for the children's father, he was a ghost in their lives, absent, disconnected, and uninvolved. These children had lived their lives without the love of a mother or a father, abandoned and forgotten by those who should have cared for them the most. The only family they had left was distant, and for too long, no one had stepped forward to help. But now, there was hope. The children were placed with a relative through protective services, taken from the horror that had been their daily existence. For the first time in years, they were receiving the care, love, and attention they desperately needed. The relief was palpable. They no longer had to wake up to the smell of filth. They no longer had to hide in the shadows, hoping someone would come to rescue them. They were safe, finally. As their future began to shift, a community stepped in to offer its support. Donations poured in from people who had heard their story, from neighbors who had been unaware of the nightmare that had unfolded right under their noses. People rallied, offering clothes, toys, and financial assistance to help the children rebuild their lives. It was heartening to see that in the wake of such horror, there was a glimmer of hope. These children would never forget what happened, but they could now look forward to a future that offered something they hadn't known in years: care and compassion. But as the story unfolded, one question lingered in the air. How did it happen? How did everyone miss the signs? The neighbors, the school district, the family. How did they all allow this to go on for so long? The community, shaken to its core, was left to reflect on what had gone wrong. How many other children were out there, in silence, suffering? How many more families were falling through the cracks? This is where the real lesson begins. The case of these children isn't just about the horror of their past. It's a wake-up call for us all. The children's story reminds us of the importance of vigilance. It's easy to get lost in the busyness of our own lives, to overlook the small details that might signal that something is wrong. But if we want to prevent another tragedy, we have to be willing to ask the hard questions. We have to look beyond the surface, beyond the front doors of our homes, and pay attention to those who may need our help. We all have a role to play in keeping children safe. If you see something, say something. If you suspect neglect or abuse, don't stay silent. Every action counts, no matter how small. No one should have to suffer in isolation, and no child should ever have to live in fear of their own home. As we close the chapter on this tragic story, let's take a moment to reflect. What can we do differently in our own lives to ensure that children are never left to suffer in silence again? What can we do to build stronger communities where no one is left to fall through the cracks? If this story has touched your heart, I urge you to take action. Like, share, and subscribe. Share this video with your friends and family, and remind them that sometimes the hardest thing we can do is to take a stand. Don't look away. Be the change that ensures no child has to endure what these 3 children have gone through. Let's stand together to protect the most vulnerable among us.